what the International Women's Year Tribune and the Decade for Women launched in terms of both supporting new autonomous women's organizations, networks, and movements to emerge on every continent, and then also generating a cadre of people who come in from different places, right? I mean, you have grassroots activists, you have intermediary and advocacy organizations, you have global women's organizations, regional women's organizations. So that kind of structuring of women's organizing and transnational women's organizing has really happened over the past 30 years. Prior to that, you had the women's international non-governmental organizations, the WLDI, the Girl Guides, the International Federation of University Women, which did amazing work and really laid the basis, right? Those are the shoulders of giants that we stand on. But it was really in the past 40 years that a whole slew of autonomous women's organizations at all levels emerged, and that emergence at local, national, regional, and global level is what creates a transnational feminist movement. When you look at what's happening on the ground, whether in, sexually harassing women who come out to protest in Cairo, or the massive demonstrations about sexual assault in India, or the young women here on college campuses who are coming forward around sexual violence. Denise's point is, if you see the backlash against those young women and men as patriarchy as usual, then you're missing the script. That patriarchy is changing in part because of the success of women's organizing and women's movements. I think APWLD analysis, and also just looking around, and the empirical evidence suggests that while there is an exponential increase in money for women and girls, there is, what has not followed suit is money for women's organizing. And what people, I think, either forget or don't know or question, even if you assert this, is that many of the things we're talking about today, right? Even if it's the girl effect, even if it's Nike's girl effect, right? Or protection of women's human rights defenders, or domestic violence, sexual harassment, we wouldn't be talking about those things if there hadn't been an autonomous women's movement and a transnational network of feminist networks. Those things wouldn't have made it onto the agenda. So I think what is bone-chilling right now is that we see a window opening, we see more interest and acceptance of the importance of women's rights, gender equality, women's empowerment, whichever entry point you use, than we ever have before. Many new actors coming in, whether it's Nike or IKEA or ExxonMobil or Goldman Sachs, right? Many more, or Melinda Gates or Sheryl, what's her name? Sandberg, right? So we have many new feminist sisters that we never really expected were going to be coming into the tent, and bravo. But without continuing to, as APWLD says, take care of the roots, right? If you're only watering the leaves, eventually the tree dies.
And this is the year really to ask ourselves those questions, because we invest in a lot in trying to shape the new development goals, and in the review of the Beijing process, as well as the climate negotiations, and being in all these intergovernmental spaces. And at the moment they're looking like they won't necessarily deliver the ambition that we need and want. And I think at the end of this year we'll probably have to sit down and say, if governments are not democratic, if they're not going to deliver both in their existing promises but also to reshape the world that they've created, what are the other options for us? But on the other hand, we've found that there is some advantage in being in the space which is basically as you say, the transnational space it gives us, the possibility to come together and bring a collective voice to, to tell the governments directly, but also to shape our own space. I think that's been one of the things that we've found at the regional level that we've done probably for the first time really in the last few years, is use the UN space at the regional level to try and create greater solidarity amongst civil society and amongst women's movements, and at the sub-regional level. And even if we're not really getting strong outcomes from governments, we're in spaces where some women don't have any space at the national level. They have no space to talk to their governments. And then if they can find that space at the regional level, they're in the room with the government, they can make them accountable, they can potentially at least hear what the governments have to say, but also hopefully respond and hopefully engage. They've appreciated that. They've appreciated the fact that they're actually getting a voice in a process where they're shut out at the national level. And then coming together and seeing what we can do collectively. So I certainly think we cannot put our ambition and hopes into these processes as the end. I think they have to be a means, and not even a means to create stronger language, but a means to have a stronger political voice and a stronger movement.
Well, I think if you look back on the last 20 years, you really see a movement of the issues from the women's movement and the margins onto the mainstream. Again, the reality, the implementation is still a long way off. And perhaps the biggest sign of success is the backlash itself, the recognition that women are an important political force. Well, I think one of the big challenges that we have now that we need to address before Beijing plus 40 is the growing gap between women who are benefiting from the changes that feminism has brought and the women who've been left behind. And I see this when we talk about poverty. It's not only poverty, it's also situations where women are marginalized, rural areas where even the women who may not be poor are still living out very tradition-bound lives, where the kind of rights that we want to see available to women, even in the rural U.S. It's very hard for anyone to be a feminist and to really live out those ideas because of growing conservative pressures on women. So I see this worldwide as both an issue of income inequality and poverty generally, but I also see it as inequality amongst women, that many of us have very much benefited, and we live very differently. And I think that's widespread in the middle and upper middle classes of most of the world. But in the process, the gap has grown between women who get a chance and those who don't. So in that sense, we have to address the intersection of those issues of class and race and access. And that includes very much gendered issues, but gendered issues as they shape the lives of women who are marginalized by other factors as well. To me, that's the biggest challenge that we face. There are many other challenges that we face along the way, but I think in some ways the backlash is a battle over that. It's a battle over whether the rest of the women will get a chance to go in a more feminist direction and have at least that opportunity, or whether they will be further tied into a very conservative traditional web, whether it's nationalistic or religious or just conservative culturally. I mean, I think what we need now, whether we do it through a Fifth World Conference or through the kinds of conferences that we have with AWID and with the 100th anniversary of WILPF in The Hague coming up, is we need to rebuild and reimagine ourselves as a political feminist force in the world. And I think we've used the UN very effectively for 25 or 30 years, but we need to be a little bit more outside of that and pressuring it in a new way, because I think the UN has we've kind of gotten bogged down in that methodology. And it's not to me that we ignore that arena, but we need to remember that we are a political force that must always stand outside of that. That's why we are NGOs. And it's not so much to beat up on the UN. I think sometimes people waste their time saying, oh, the UN didn't do this, UN didn't do that. The UN is the governments of the world. And we need to be clear that we are a political force who needs to change the governments of the world. And that is part of the process of changing the UN. And sometimes being in the UN arena helps us change the governments in the world, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you have to do it from a different place. So I think we need to kind of reassert that we are that strong, independent force of feminism that is challenging governments, that is challenging the UN, and that wants to bring out the best of what we want from governments in the future. And I hope that's what the peace movement will be doing in The Hague. I think that's the hope of that we will kind of reimagine ways of struggle that meet the times that we're in now, because they have changed a lot, and nothing was wrong, quotes, with what we did before, but we have to reimagine what to do today. And I think the alliances across movements is really the direction that we need to go. And in some ways, it's sort of full circle in my mind, because I came to feminism out of the civil rights and the anti-war movement in the US. Many of the Latin American women came to feminism out of struggles against dictatorships and movements for social change, and certainly in the Philippines and other parts of the world that happened too. We came to feminism out of other kinds of political struggles, and I think we're feeling the clarity that, especially, again, as I said, to address the women who've been left behind, we have to address and be in cross movement with all the other forces that are also affecting women more effectively by cross movement dialogue. It is the future for all of us, and all of those issues are interlinked.
Maybe what we need to think of more is making that link between the work that's being done at grassroots level in our communities with the multilateral system to inform and change the multilateral system. At the moment there is a disjunct, and it could be that we have invested so much in making these processes work that we have forgotten to elevate the voices of those who really are working grassroots. It could be that. We have to work and engage with the multilateral system to a greater or lesser extent. It's the only game in town at the moment. It's the only one that is going to stop war eventually. So we need to engage with it, we need to change it. And I think that is increasingly, for me, becoming obvious that it's at grassroots level where that will start to organise, and the way in which we can then build that into much more of a movement for change. Because I think, just talking to someone now, I think even in our own countries, people are getting angry at the lack of real democracy, at the exclusion of their voices in really making a difference. Because it's we can talk about corporations, we can talk about how the macroeconomic system is now dominated by so few, we can talk about how few people own so much of the world's wealth and the huge discriminations that emanate as a result of that. So I think it's becoming known, and once it becomes known, what we need to do is to organise so that that knowledge is then translated into actions which will lead to a difference. And it won't all just be through the multilateral system. No, it won't. But I think it's, as I said, it is one piece of the puzzle, but not the complete puzzle.
But nobody was really looking at all at the law. That was not, or rights, I should say. That was not part of the framework, and it didn't fit in. And if I sat down and took a little time, I could probably track these various trends that I saw, and then they'd suddenly fall out of a favor, and then we'd be on to something else. But at the point that we started, and even phrasing this, coming to this term, was that it's not just about basic needs. It's also about basic rights and women's awareness of their rights. So one of the things that we, in all of the teaching, we just, and the women would just concur with this everywhere in the world, that most women did not think of themselves as subject to rights. In Nairobi, 1985, equality, development, and peace. So we started raising issues like violence against women, and they'd say, hey, what does that have to do with development? So the attempt to really engage women in this process of analysis, of developing a conceptual framework to look at their own situation and try to then develop strategies to change things. And then we started to look at some of these issues from that perspective of human rights. So that also began to permeate our basic framework, and then we started to look again at how you would use, basically how you could use the human rights in order to achieve progress at the national and local level. Affirm their right to legitimate defense, and affirm their belief in themselves as people and women who are subject of rights. And I think that, it's such a process, and even being able to name something is empowering. Women who haven't had the opportunity to have a lot of education, they get it. And they also get really excited when all of a sudden they have some new vocabulary to talk about these things, talk about their own experiences. The friendship and solidarity they have with women from other countries, but it's really the work that's happening on the ground.
But being in New York permitted me to go to the first CEDAW meeting, the CEDAW session, for some reason that I have to investigate. Why was it meeting there in New York when it was still in Vienna in those days? This was 1986 or 1985. And I read the convention and absolutely fell in love with it, and started going to, at least trying to go to one session of the CEDAW committee from then on. And that's when I started sort of being part of ERA, not ERA Asia Pacific, but ERA, which brought women from around the world to come to see the CEDAW committee and present their shadow reports. But their way of working was very different from what later became ERA Asia Pacific, which I always thought was, I met Shanthi in this meeting of ERA, and then Shanthi explained that she was starting this ERA Asia Pacific, and I really liked the idea. And for many years I tried to do something similar to ERA Asia Pacific in Costa Rica, but it was, or in Latin America, but it wasn't possible because we have an organization in Latin America called CLADEM. You've heard of it. So they were not very happy with another organization doing that, but they don't really focus on CEDAW. But anyway, so it didn't happen. So I always started working more and more with ERA Asia Pacific, and then when Global to Local started, I've been a part of it ever since. I've gone to at the beginning to all the Global to Local sessions, then nowadays just to one a year, because there's 3 meetings a year. I couldn't be doing this all the time, but I do a lot of work around, and it's the women in Central America, for example, the indigenous women in Central America, who are taking the lead in the defense of the land. Right, in Guatemala and in Honduras you see it much more than in other places, but and in Mexico obviously, but in Guatemala it's the indigenous women who put themselves against the big transnational mining companies or whatever, all the transnational corporations, and they're getting killed like flies also, which is something that has then aroused the rest of the women to come in support, and has helped women see that this is a form of violence against women also, when they kill women because they're defending their land. And so there is much more cohesive now, or solidarity between the feminist movement in Honduras, for example. You see the feminist movement and the campesino movement or the indigenous movement are very close in the work that they're doing against this horrible state that they have, which is really a puppet state of the corporations. I still believe in the UN. I think it has so many imperfections, but there's no other place where states can talk to each other, and where human rights are thought about and discussed in an international way. Where else? Doing international work without the grassroots work is ridiculous. It would be absurd. And doing grassroots work now without the richness that the international brings you, and the solidarity of other communities, and the understanding that when you understand all harmful practice and you see that patriarchy is all over the place, it's not about being against indigenous people or against Africa when you're against FGM. It's because we are against any practice that is discriminatory or harmful to women, or that violates human rights. And when more and more people understand that, we begin to have a common language, which is really helpful. And
so Aurora, as a veteran of both Beijing and being on the CEDAW committee, what do you think the most important outcomes of this meeting have been?
Well, I think for one thing, it recognizes that Beijing is the reference point of all our discussions, and that the Beijing Conference Declaration and Platform for Action is a great victory for all women. It was a product of intensive discussions, of a lot of consensus, but it remains to be the most progressive document that we have when it comes to women's rights. In this conference, there were many attempts to water down, the substantive essence of the Beijing conference. But the good thing about this conference is that the civil society sector is solid, and it is strong, and it has done its work in terms of influencing governments not to water down any of the basic articles of Beijing. In a way, for some issues, it remained stationary, which means that it did not go far enough in terms of recognizing, for instance, issues of the SOGI and then issues of sexual rights. But we expected that, because some countries would never really give up their own beliefs on certain issues. But that Beijing, for me, is broad enough and inclusive enough to really take on board all of those issues that are being raised by SOGI, for instance, not in a very direct and comprehensive way, but that a recognition that discrimination of any kind, of any form, to anyone is unacceptable. And I think that has been affirmed in this conference. And more than that, I think it went into areas which were not there before, like ICT, for instance. ICT is a new emerging issue on violence against women, but at the same time, it also recognizes the opportunities that can offer, that technology can offer to women. So some of these things are new. And I think the other new thing that I see in this conference is the presence of young women, the next generation women's movement, which I think is important to really sustain and expand the victories in Beijing. That is not a very easy process, because we always have to deal with governments that have opposing views, that have regressive ideas on women. And in fact, this is the era of contradictions about women's rights advancing on one hand, and on the other hand, the emergence of fundamentalist groups, movements, and even governments that try to bring down all of those gains by the women's movement. So I think what we aim for in the 20th year of Beijing is not only to retain the victories and the gains of Beijing, but to move it forward. To move it forward in a way that is inclusive of all women. For instance, the persons with disability, women with disabilities, is so highlighted in this conference that was not there before. So we're very happy about that. Of course, the participation of indigenous women, the Sogi community, and governments that are very open and are very promotive of women's rights across all sectors. So the contribution of my own government is to say that women's groups, and specifically feminist groups, must be recognized across all ideological shades because the movement is a broad movement, it's an inclusive movement, and it cannot move forward unless we recognize the validity of the advocacies of different groups, whether we agree with them or not. You may not like transgender people, but they have rights. They are human beings. They are also entitled to all of those rights that we all enjoy. So I think Beijing will prevail. Beijing will move forward. Thank you.
Okay, since Beijing, we have continued to visibilize the issues of women. I think that has been, to an extent, made globally. And then when it comes to women in decision making, you'll recall that at the time of Beijing, we were about at 10.5. Now we are like 22%, if we are talking about the globe. And the continent where I'm coming from, actually, our statistics are kind of aligned with the global averages because we are at about 24. However, these gains, we tend to make them up there, like representation of women in parliament. In a few of our countries, speaking of SADC, our region, some of the countries are making headway even in local government levels, such as Lesotho. But coming closer to my home, Swaziland, there's rather too much emphasis. So the gains have been at a higher level, like in parliament, that there's emphasis that there should be a certain level of representation, the critical minority of 30%, although we have never reached it, but even in the constitution it is reflected, although we are it is not being implemented. However, we're still failing to make gains right at the bottom, at grassroots level. And then on the other hand, there has been a lot of backlash. Okay, when we look at effectiveness of using those international instruments, it has been more on visibilizing the struggles of women at international level and coming home with the tools that have been designed at designed and agreed on at international level, such as the Beijing Platform for Action. However, when it gets to home, there are serious challenges, bearing in mind that, of course, engaging at international level takes a lot of time for the very people that are supposed to be working at national level. And then the countries themselves, our governments, they tend to be in agreement with other governments at international level because, of course, those agreements are made through a process of consensus. But when you come back home, it becomes a struggle to have them ratified, and once they've been ratified, domestication almost never takes place. Moreover, when it comes to working now at home, there is more of a challenge, and it is getting worse than getting better, of accessing funding. So civil society organizations almost have no budget to work on, but the people, their constituencies, and everybody expects them to deliver. I think what is most important is for us in society to understand that these international instruments, they are not for our governments. We need to understand that our governments are the duty bearers, and that we further need to understand that we have a responsibility of making sure that our constituents, the women, understand the contents thereof. Because so long as they do not understand fully and appreciate that these are their rights, not privilege, for as long as women do not appreciate that it is the duty of governments to ensure that they, women, are protected and that they enjoy those rights, then they will never be. So what I'm getting at is that for CEDAW or any instrument to be translated to being real, there has to be a human rights-based approach, meaning that the women or the people that it seeks to protect should understand the rights.
Would not be relevant if women from the national and local level did not contribute to that discussion. That is the idea. And that idea was really mooted by Aphane Fraser, you might know her, from the University of Minnesota, the Women and Public Policy Division of the Humphrey Institute. And she was at Nairobi and gathered together women activists were there from all over the world and presented this idea to them, and in this sense to work really on CEDAW as the Women's Treaty. They used to call it the Women's Convention those days. We hardly say that today, but that was a Women's Convention, and she said we have to get involved in contributing to the international dialogue on this. Otherwise, it's just the treaty body and governments, the state parties that are discussing it. And she says we have to, as women, get into that dialogue and bring realities of women's lives into that dialogue. And the idea took on, and Aphane Fraser followed it up with producing shallow reports to the CEDAW committee after that annually through the Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs of the University of Minnesota. She also put together a group of international women's rights activists who helped in the production of these shadow reports in terms of information and data from different countries. It so happened that by 1989, I was part of that I got into that international team. Alda Facio was there as well, Shireen Haq from Bangladesh. It was a very interesting exercise because annually we would go to the CEDAW, this whole team would go to the CEDAW session. We would have given information on the countries that have been that are reporting. The Minnesota would put together the shadow report document, and this was the first time the CEDAW committee was getting alternative information around 88. They started from about soon after Nairobi. So, and the committee found this information very useful. It used to be produced under the aegis of the University of Minnesota. I was there in 1989, and I looked at it and I said, this is one level of work, which is the international level. You're enhancing the capacity of the CEDAW committee to be more rigorous in the way they engage with in the dialogue and to produce better concluding observations, but the implementation of those concluding observations is still very weak because state parties do not go back and educate anybody about what has happened at the review. And women from these reporting countries don't even know that this review is taking place. Very few people at that time knew about the CEDAW Convention. So there's a huge gap. And the second thing was, while an international team and the own research capability of the University of Minnesota was bringing the data together, we were doing it without the wisdom of the women on the ground. You know, this was a very academic exercise, what we thought was important. And I said, that was the other thing. I said, how are we so confident that this is the information that should go to the committee? So I said, we must start work on the ground at the national level and involve women at the national level. it provides the standards for enhancing their own work, whichever theme or subject matter that they are working on, and therefore the concept of equality and non-discrimination has to be integrated into their own work. That their work, if it's health or if it's employment or violence, first of all, that a human rights approach has to be taken.
But I think the enemy is quite clear that who's really dangerous right now are the feminists who can work in a positive relation to all those struggles and who see the future as requiring the success of all those struggles. And that, you know, deaths are happening. Men are killing women who get into the front of the fight for water, the fight to protect the babies, the fight against prostitution, the fight against the forced migrations, the fight to demand access to basic needs. It's a very dangerous time for feminists.
Well, there are multiple ways forward, and of course there's nothing more important than strengthening local and national capacities and networks to organize and put pressure, you know, as close to where the issues are happening and where women's human rights defenders' lives are under the greatest threat. But there are two things about the way forward that I think are important. One, as far as the Fifth World Conference on Women goes, which I firmly believe could be both galvanizing and especially important for a new generation of feminist leaders to articulate the priorities that they are living right now. I think that some organization, UN Women would be the logical one, to put out a call. So I think the conversation often goes to, should we have a conference or shouldn't we have a conference? And I don't think that's really the question. I think the question is, what kind of conference do we need or might we need to achieve what kind of purpose? And so what I would like to see is a global conversation started about that with enough trajectory to give time to really have a thoughtful, inclusive discussion about that. And so we were thinking that, well, what if UN Women put out a call and asked for, you know, groups, think tanks emerging in different regions to think about that. So what kind of conference process, not a conference, what kind of process would actually strengthen transnational networks and local and national networks? So let's open it up. Let's not assume that what happened before needs to happen now, but let's ask the question and bring all the creativity and connection and ideas we have, right, to be thinking differently about this, which will also, by the way, help the entire UN and help global governance negotiations in general. So I'd like to see some process by which that starts to get discussed, acknowledging what we gained from past processes, but really thinking about going forward. And of course, just to state the caveat, the Beijing Platform for Action is not under negotiation. It's not to be opened up. The Nairobi forward-looking strategies were not opened up to come to the BPFA, and you don't do this. So that's one.